Good morning, everyone. We're continuing along Moreh Nevukhim, and I apologize that it's been a little bit choppy, sporadic, just because of different schedules. Next week we also won't have a shir because it'll be Shavuos, but we'll meet again, Mirz Hashem, in 2 weeks from today. We're in the first section, chapter 7, in Moreh Nevukhim, and as we mentioned before, the Rambam's project, at least at this point in the Sefer, is to define certain words and phrases that appear in Tanakh that appear to be describing physical phenomena, but in reality are more descriptive of either metaphysical phenomena or perhaps descriptions of something that is taking place on an intellectual plane, and that has nothing, and that when sometimes in its context, it is really not a physical designation, but rather a metaphysical or intellectual designation. And the Rambam, of course, is continuing this project because, of course, part of the philosopher's role is to clarify for us that Hashem and much of his universe is very divested of the physical trappings that we normally associate with everything that exists in this world. And so the next word that the Rambam is dealing with, it's the shoresh is Yud Lamed Daled, which is Yeled, Yalad, Laledet. That whole family of words has to do with giving birth. But as the Rambam's going to, and by the way, today we're going to see something that has nothing to do with this word, but the Rambam sort of lets out of the bag, and it's one of the very one of the more astonishing things that the Rambam holds as one of his unique positions. But we're going to get to that shortly. First, let's define the word yalod or yeled, and that verb, the notion understood by means of this word is well known. It is that of procreation. When you use this three-letter shoresh as a verb, it means to give birth to or to procreate. And so you have the Hebrew psukim in your handout. And by the way, the handout, for those who are listening or watching on Facebook, we have a Facebook group called Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim, and the handout is up there already for chapter 7. So the Torah talks about in Parshas Ki Tavo that if a person has 2 wives, v'yoladulo vanim, and they give birth to sons to him. Okay, so that's clearly the normal designation of that verb. Afterwards, this word is used figuratively to designate the bringing to existence of natural things. It doesn't necessarily refer to creatures giving birth to offspring, but it could also be referring in the larger term of things coming into existence that are given existence by their antecedent. Okay, so for example, in Tehillim, B'terem harim yuladu, before the mountains were brought forth. Now, mountains are not born, but mountains are given existence. That we are referring to Hashem, that even before the mountains were born, Hashem, you existed in the world. It is likewise used figuratively to designate by analogy with procreation the notion of earth bringing forth her vegetal produce. Thus, from Sefer Yeshayahu, Ki ka'asher yered hageshem v'hashelag min hashamayim, the very famous haftorah from a fast day. Ki im hirva et haaretz, the rain sates the earth, v'holida v'hitzmicha. So here you have that word from the word yeled, v'holida, it gives birth. The rain gives birth to things that grow from the earth. Now, of course, rain doesn't give birth to anything, but it's used in a figurative or metaphorical sense. It was likewise used figuratively with reference to happenings occurring in time, as though they were things that were born. A beautiful pasuk from Mishlei. Al tishalel biyom machar. The book of Proverbs says, do not take pride in what will happen tomorrow. Ki lo seida ma yeled yom, because you don't know what the new day will give birth to, will give rise to. It's King Solomon's way of saying, don't count your chickens before they're hatched, right? Okay. So again, it's using that verb. It was likewise used figuratively with reference to happenings within thought and the opinions and doctrines that they entail. And here's where the Rambam gets into the idea of it having an intellectual meaning as well. That sometimes you can give birth to ideas, both positive and negative. And therefore, the pasuk in Tehillim, Hine yechabel avin v'hara amal v'yolad sheker, that a sinner gives birth to sinful ideas or sinful or false thoughts. Okay, so therefore also you just like you can spawn an idea, you give birth to an idea, you give birth to a concept, right? And we use this in the English language as well. It is a derivation from this meaning when it is said, "And they please themselves in the children of strangers," and this is a pasuk in Yeshaya that refers to the Jews that are allowing themselves to succumb to the ideologies of idolatry of the time. It says, "Uviyaldei nochrim yaspiku," that they please themselves with the children of idolaters. Now, some commentaries explain that it's referring to intermarriage, that people of the time were intermarrying and having children who therefore were not Jewish and were given over to idolatry. But the Radak, and as the Rambam quotes Yonasan ben Uziel, it says they walk according to the laws of the Gentiles. Because basically what it means is that they forsake Hashem's ways and they follow the spawnings or the offspring of the idolatrous nations, which means that they follow their ideologies, they follow their ideas, they follow their ways. Though that is the offspring of the idolatrous peoples that the Jews were interacting with. In this sense, whoever instructs an individual in some matter and teaches him an opinion has, as far as his being provided with this opinion is concerned, as it were, engendered that individual, which means that kol hamelamed es ben chavero Torah ki'ilu yelado. As our sages say, that if you teach your friend's child Torah, it is as if you gave birth to him. So the Rambam says this is to be taken in a very real sense, because you give birth to ideas in that other person's mind, so you've given substance to that person's mind, and therefore it's like you've given birth to them. In this sense, the prophet's disciples were called sons of the prophets, as we shall explain when treating the equivocality of the term son. We have this concept of B'nei HaNeviim that we'll find in Tanakh. So B'nei HaNeviim are apprentices. They are prophecy apprentices, and we find this. Shmuel, for example, was an apprentice of Eli, the Kohen Gadol of the time, and he was when he was but a lad, he started to become frequent in the idea of hearing the voice of God. But he was a Ben HaNavi. He was the offspring of a Navi, sort of the apprentice of a Navi, because he didn't yet understand what prophecy really was, and it took him some time to figure it out. In this figurative sense, it is said of Adam, and Adam lived 130 years and begot a son in his own likeness after his image. Now we get to the main event. The main event is the Rambam going back to the story of creation, because that's part of his project, which is to discuss Ma'aseh Bereshit. And over here he says, let's talk about a pasuk that appears in the 5th chapter of Genesis, which talks about the birth of Seth, Shes. Okay, Seth is the only child that Adam has, who is the father of all of future human beings. Cain and Hevel don't make it. The Torah says that Adam and Chava are vayoled banim uvanos. He gave birth to many sons and daughters, but we don't seem to see, using the chronicles of the Torah, that they went anywhere as far as they themselves had many children, but the people who survived the flood were Noach and his sons, who are the descendants of Shes. Now, according to the Rambam, there was something special and unique about Shes, because the Torah says, Vayoled bidmuso kitsalmo. He gave birth to Shes, not just biologically, but passed over to Shes his own likeness after his image. So now the Rambam is going to explain to us This doesn't just mean that he biologically gave birth to him, that he provided the genetic material for him to be born, but also implanted within him some of his intellectual essence that which is what made Shais unique from all of other Adam's children. It has already been explained to you what the meaning of the image of Adam and his likeness is. We had that in a previous chapter when we talked about the image of God, that Adam is created in God's image. That doesn't necessarily mean the physical image, because God doesn't have a physical image, but we said it refers to the intellectual likeness, that Adam was created with an intellect. Now, none of the children of Adam born before Seth had been endowed with true human form, which is the image of Adam and his likeness, referred to in the words, the image of God and his likeness. This is a very dramatic statement. And what essentially the Rambam is suggesting is that Adam bore many children, but only one of his children, and that is Seth, had what he calls the image of God and his likeness. So when we're dealing with the earliest of generations of mankind, we are dealing with human beings that do not have the image of God. Now, we'll just touch very briefly, because of time constraints, on the whole issue of evolution and the different theories that exist today about how to reconcile the Torah with scientific theory. We know that Darwin's theory is that man has evolved from lower forms of lower orders of creature. Man comes from apes. Many people find this to be quite antithetical to Torah ideas, but as has been discussed countless times by many different thinkers, is that there are ways to reconcile even evolution with the Torah, in that when the Torah brings Adam and Chava onto the stage for the first time, they are the first creatures that have the image of God. This does not mean that there weren't other human beings that didn't have the image of God. There were other human beings that lived possibly even before Adam and Chava that looked like human beings, but did not possess sufficient intellect in order to be able to think with clarity, to have free will, to have self-awareness, or to have awareness of God, or to be able to fulfill the divine directive for which the human being ultimately was created. And the Rambam seems to be saying this, is that Adam was along the evolutionary scale such that he was able to give birth to another human being in his likeness, but because he's on that cusp of evolution, there are other children that are born to him that do not possess sufficient intellect or sufficient free will or sufficient self-awareness or awareness of purpose to be able to be called being created in the image of God. Now, I'm using very non-religious terminology here. I'm using scientific terminology here because the Rambam strikes us as using that kind of terminology. We can talk about other commentaries like Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, who talks about an elite genetic material that seems to be metaphysical that existed within Adam, that he passed along to only a subset of his progeny. But I'm just looking at the Rambam now, and it seems that the Rambam is using a type of terminology that says that there's a certain likeness of God which is directly synonymous with intellect. If you have sufficient intellect, it means you're created in God's likeness. And so that means that other children of Adam lacked the sufficient intellect to achieve the function of humanity. It doesn't mean that Adam didn't love them. It doesn't mean that they didn't look like you and me. But it does mean that they lacked the image of God to be able to fulfill the purpose of a human being, which is to live to a higher standard, whether it's the Torah or the Sheva Mitzvahs, B'nai Noach, and so forth. As for Seth, it was after Adam had instructed him and procured him understanding, and after he had attained human perfection, that it was said of him, and Adam begot a son in his own likeness after his image. Now, what the Rambam has just told us is that it took Adam 130 years after the previous story of Cain and Hevel, before Seth was born. Why did it take a full 130 years? It's because Adam needed to go through a process himself before he would be capable of passing on whatever he needed to of his own humanity over to Seth. You know that whoever is not endowed with this form, whose signification we have explained is not a man but an animal having the shape and configuration of man. In other words, a human being can be a human being but doesn't have the proper intellect to have the image of God. Such a being, however, has a faculty to cause various kinds of harm and to produce evils that is not possessed by the other animals. And what he means is that when you are subhuman but above an animal, you can actually do much more damage to creation, because you have many of the faculties of humanity, but you are dangerous because you don't have that higher calling and higher purpose. So therefore, criminality among humans is much more prevalent than it is among animals. A person can be endowed with a Yetzer Hara, but doesn't have sufficient humanity to have a Yetzer HaTov, and so they can wreak havoc. Animals only kill when they're hungry, but human beings who don't have sufficient image of God sparks within them can do even more damage than that. For he applies the capacities for thought and perception which were to prepare him to achieve a perfection that he has not achieved, to all kinds of machinations entailing evils and occasioning and engendering all kinds of harm. Accordingly, he is, as it were, a thing resembling man or imitating him. And so therefore, says the Rambam, it is necessary for Adam himself, after his fall from grace, after his sin, Adam goes through, according to the Rambam, a period of 130 years of tshuva, of maturation, and of really self-reflection and self-perfection, and putting himself to a position of intellectual harmony before he's able to give birth to a child that has those same qualities. Because according to the Rambam, if a person's intellect is not settled and is not harmonious, and he engages in procreation when his mind is in a state of chaos, then the offspring of that chaotic intellectual state will also have that same intellectual confusion. And therefore, in order for Seth to have been born, it was necessary for Adam to have gone through that period of 130 years, which according to our sages, he was doing tshuva, he was finding himself, he was coming to terms with his reality of who he was. And then when he came to that state of intellectual harmony and perfection, he was able to have a child who would have that same level of the image of God and that intellectual harmony and perfection. Okay? Now, what was Adam doing during those 130 years before he gave birth to Seth? So the Rambam says that he had children, but those children were subhuman. They did not have sufficient intellectual harmony because Adam himself could not imbue them through the procreation process with intellectual harmony and perfection. And therefore, he writes, the children of Adam who preceded Seth were of this sort. The authors of the Midrash say accordingly, during the entire period of 130 years when Adam was under rebuke, meaning when he was under God's ban, Hashem had banned him for eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And in a sense, what the Midrash is essentially saying is that Adam was under self-exile. He felt that he was an outcast, and he couldn't come to terms with his new reality. It took 130 years for him to reorient himself and accept where he was. He begot spirits, they mean devils. When, however, he again accorded him his favor, he begot a son resembling him, I mean in his own likeness after his image. Accordingly, it says, and Adam lived 130 years and begot a son in his own likeness after his image. Now, what is the Rambam referring to over here when he says that during the 130 years when Adam was an outcast, he gave birth to demons and spirits? He's referring to a Gemara in Maseches Eruvin, Daf Yud Ches Amud Beis. You have it on the first page of the source number 8. I'm just going to read this source, and then we're going to get into a little bit of a controversial situation with the Rambam, in case evolution was not controversial enough for you. Va'amar Rebbe Yirmiyah ben Elazar, Kol otan hashanim shahaya Adam harishon benidui, Holid ruchin v'shedin v'lilin. That all those years that Adam was under a ban, meaning that he was an outcast, but it seems more that he was self-exiled because he couldn't yet come to terms. He was involved with tshuva during this whole time. He gave birth to spirits, demons, and lilin. You ever hear of Lilith? Right? So there are other midrashic traditions that say that the reason why they're called lilin is because they're the offspring of Lilith, the queen of the demons. Right? All of this is in the mystical tradition, which the Rambam has no part of. Okay? Shenemar vayichi Adam shaloshimu me'at shana vayolid bidmuto kitzalmo. That Adam lived as, and how do I know this? That he gave birth to demons and spirits? Because the Torah writes in Genesis chapter 5 that Adam lived 130 years, and then finally he was able to give birth to a child in his own likeness and image. Michlal da'ad ha'idna lav kitzalmo olid, which implies that he did give birth, right, from the verb yeled. He did give birth before 130 years, just not to beings who were of his likeness and his image. And therefore Rashi and most other commentaries learn the Gemara in the most simplistic, straightforward sense, that it means he gave birth to demons and spirits, not human beings. But the Rambam doesn't learn that way. Let's just finish off the Gemara. Meitvei, so the Gemara raises a contradiction. Haya Rabbi Meir Omer Adam Harishon Chasid Gadol Haya, Keven Shara'a Sheniknesa Mita al Yado, Yashav Betanit Me'au Shloshim Shana, Upiresh Min Ha'isha Me'au Shloshim Shana, Vehela Zarzei Teinim al Bisaro Me'au Shloshim Shana. How can you tell me that Adam had children during that 130-year period when it says explicitly that he imposed upon himself self-imposed exile and flagellated himself and separated from his wife? He lived a life of asceticism, so how could he give birth to children if he didn't have a marital life? So the Gemara's answer is Ki kamrinan hahu b'shichva zera dechazeh le'unsei. So the Gemara answers, these spirits were born not through procreation in the normal sense of a husband and wife, but because of his biological needs. He had, let's say, nocturnal emissions. And that's what those emissions were the things that gave birth to these demons and spirits. You look at this Gemara, and it seems quite clear that it's referring to some kind of mystical phenomenon of Adam's semen giving birth to these demonic forces that the Gemara talks about throughout Shas, that the demons, the shadim, that exist and cause and wreak havoc and mayhem in people's lives are a product of the 130 years where Adam was creating demonic forces and demonic spirits. Okay? That's the simple way of understanding the Gemara. But you see from here that the Rambam does not understand the Gemara that way. The Rambam says the rabbis are speaking purely figuratively. There's no such thing as Adam giving birth to demons and spirits. I don't buy it. What the Torah really means and what Chazal are communicating to us is that Adam gave birth to human beings who were subhuman in that they didn't have sufficient intellect. Simply like we explained, because Adam himself did not have the harmonious intellect because he had imposed this exile upon himself, could not come to terms for 130 years with who he was and what he had done and where he was, and therefore did not have the settledness of mind, the harmony of spirit, to be able to procreate children who would have that spirit. By the way, this is taken for granted in Talmudic medicine, that whatever your mental state and your emotional state is at the time of procreation is going to affect the offspring. This is predominant throughout medieval literature. It's not just in Jewish literature, right? But this is something that is a reality to the Rambam. It's scientific for the Rambam. And that's the reason why the offspring of Adam were subhuman. But they were human beings. They looked like human beings. They spoke perhaps like human beings. They acted like human beings. But they didn't have the image of Hashem because they didn't have the intellectual spark of conscience, perhaps. They were given to mayhem and to damage because they had a Yetzer Hara, but not necessarily the necessary Yetzer HaTov that they needed. Now the reason why this is controversial is because this is one of the clearest indicators There are many indications that we won't have time to go into today, but it is one of the clearest indicators that the Rambam, throughout his various writings, does not subscribe to a belief in Shadim. Simply doesn't believe they exist. Anytime you find our sages referring to Shadim, and there is literature throughout the Talmud and the Medrash that is replete with Shadim, they are not to be taken literally, because the Rambam was a rationalist. He didn't believe in magic. He didn't believe in incantations. He didn't believe in any of that stuff. And he didn't believe in demonic forces. He felt that was pure superstition. An example of this, if you take a look at source number 10 in the Shulchan Aruch, it says in Yoredeya, Mishan ashcho akrav mutar lilchosh alav. If you get bitten, God forbid, by a scorpion, the Shulchan Aruch, quoting the Rambam, says that you're allowed to recite an incantation in order to help alleviate the bite. Va'afilu b'Shabbos, and you can do this on Shabbos as well. And then, quoting the Rambam, the Shulchan Aruch, Rav Yosef Karo writes, Ve'afal pi she'ein hadavar mo'il klum. This has absolutely no effect whatsoever. Incantations are meaningless, says the Rambam. But umesukan hu hitiro, hola mesukan hu hitiru. The rabbis permitted it because they felt that since you may go into shock because of the emotional trauma of getting bitten by a scorpion, they felt that they could justify allowing you to do this because it'll settle your mind. Kidei shelo titaref da'ato alav, so that your mind does not tear you apart, meaning that you don't go nuts. And so the Vilna Gaon from the 18th century says, this is a direct quote from the Rambam. V'chein kasav b'pirush HaMishnah lefi divarav da'avodat kochavim. Leperik Daled Avodat Kochavim. And the Rambam writes the same idea, that there is no value to incantations whatsoever. It's purely a psychological placebo kind of thing. Avol kol haboim acharav chalku alav, but anyone who came after him disagreed with the Rambam. Shaharei harbe lechashim nemru b'gemara, because after all, incantations are replete within the Talmud. V'hu nimshach achar hafilosofia ha'arura. The Vilna Gaon says that the Rambam was drawn after the cursed philosophy. V'lachein katav shekeshafim v'shemot ulechashim v'shedim ukemeot hakol hu sheker. And that is what caused the Rambam to mistakenly write that magical names, incantations, shedim, demons, amulets, all of this is false. It has no reality. It's all superstition. Aval kvar hiku otan al kod or oto al kod kado. But they've already hit the Rambam on his skull. In other words, they've already taken him to task. That's what the term means. Shaharei matzinu harbe ma'asiyot b'gemara al pi shemot ukshafim, because we find many examples of using magical in names and incantations to be able to garner a desired metaphysical result. We're skipping just a few words. V'hafilosofia hitaso berov lakcha lefaresh hagamar hakol b'derech halatziyi. That it is only because of the Rambam's attachment to philosophy that it drew him away from the correct interpretation of all of this, and he interprets it therefore metaphorically when it should be interpreted literally. V'la'akorotam mipashtan v'chas v'shalom. And God forbid, says the Gra, Eini ma'amin bahem v'lo mehem v'lo mehamonam. I do not believe in them, in the philosophers. I do not take anything from them or any of their masses. They are all wrong, the philosophical community. Ela kol ha'devarim hem kipashtan. Anytime the sages talk about these supernatural phenomena, they have to be taken literally. Ela sheyesh behen pinimiyot v'lo pinimiyot shel ba'al ha'filosofia. But when you want to learn about mystical things, there is an internal meaning to all of these things, to all of these supernatural, metaphysical, occult issues, but not the internal meaning of the philosophers who throw the real meaning in the garbage, right? But rather, so they are really the superficial. They're on the outside. The philosophers who take all of this to be superstition, but rather the real deeper meaning of all of these magical kinds of descriptions in the Gemara, there is much more to it. The Maritz Chias, who lives in the 19th century. Rav Tzvi Hirsch Chias, who's a well-known Talmudic commentator, says the same thing. We'll just look at it very quickly because of time constraints. Source number 11, this is from a short sefer called Darchei Moshe, where he tries to reconcile all of the writings of the Rambam. And it seems like no one's really prepared to subscribe to the Rambam. They just want to explain what the Rambam believes, even though they all feel that he's making a mistake because he's taking too much liberty with his understanding of certain passages in Shas. He says, Va'ayin Rambam Perek Yud Beis Mehilchos Chovel Shekatav Halacha Chet Shelo Yaniach Tavshil Tachat Hamita Shema Yapil Bo Davar Hamazik Ve'eno Ro'ehu. The Rambam paskins that you should not leave food underneath your bed. Now, you've probably heard this before. What's the reason you're not allowed to leave food underneath the bed? Because of shadim. Demonic forces might attack the food. It looks perfectly fine. You may have even left it in a plastic bag, but you still can't leave it under the bed because of the demonic forces. But the Rambam doesn't write that. He writes the reason you can't leave food underneath the bed is because something may get under your bed that's unhealthy. Germs, bugs, creatures, right? Critters, the mice, whatever it is, and the worms, and that's why you can't do it. The Harayvid hisigo sham de Yerushalmi amru hatami sham ruach ra. And the Rayvid says, what are you talking about? It's because of ruach ra, an evil spirit that might rest on the food. There's the demonic forces. Va'ayin even ha'ezer simin yud zayin shetamu al rabbeinu madu hishmit hadin b'shama kol ish ploni meit dechayshinan shema shedhu ubeva'ua dibeva'ua lo chayshinan. So another question that is asked on the Rambam, the Shulchan Aruch says, or the Gemara says, that if you hear a human voice saying, Ploni is dead, then it is on that basis you can permit his wife to remarry. But the Gemara says you have to have seen the person or at least a double shadow of that person, because if you just hear a human voice, you cannot be sure that it was really a human being. Maybe it was a demon. The Rambam omits that entire aspect of the halacha. Okay? Ba'ayin shuvas harashba simin taf yud gimel shetaf so gam kein bazeh. The Rashba is critical of the Rambam for omitting that halacha. V'haroa divra rabbeinu perk zayin mitsefer hamoreh chelak aleph bevir ma'amorim zal kolosim kuflam et shanim shaya adam harishon nazuf hayamolid ruchot v'shedim lo yikshalav ma'uma. Take a look at the Moreh Nevukhim, chapter 7, says the Maritz Chias. You will see from here that the Rambam is consistent in his belief. Ve'ein ani matzdik shitat harav bazeh. And notice how he writes, I am not here to justify the Rambam's opinion. I cannot find myself agreeing with what he says. However, achein bati laharot shekol devarav hema mikushurim echad leechad. I am just coming to show you a consistency, a pattern that the Rambam sets forth throughout his writings, that there is consistency. Some people think that there's no consistency between the Moreh Nevukhim and the Mishnah Torah. Not true. The Maritz Chias says the Rambam has consistent beliefs which are patterned throughout his writings. Part of this is, and we've touched on this before, is that the Rambam never says explicitly the rabbis got it wrong and shadim are just superstition. He would never be so bold and so brazen or chutzpahdik to suggest that explicitly. He does it by omission, and he does it very subtly in what he says over here in the 7th chapter, which is, when the rabbi said that Adam gave birth to demons, it means that he gave birth to human beings who didn't have the image of God, didn't have the intellectual harmony that you need in order to be created in the image of God. Okay, we've gone a little bit over time. Any questions, any comments? Okay, we'll come back to this issue of the Rambam's rationalism taking him astray from some of the normal beaten path of what most of the commentaries believe. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you.